this is a time when we're going to spend an hour deliberating a potential first report in response to President Obama's charge. We will ultimately have a multi-part report, but because there is a part of our report that's about the timely integration of ethics into neuroscience, we thought that we should address that in a timely fashion. So the focus of this preliminary report is the integration of ethics into neuroscience research across the life of the research endeavor. And this morning's panel was well designed to launch us into that, and we've had other conversations at earlier meetings about it. And by releasing an earlier report on ethics integration in neuroscience research, we can guide institutions in developing necessary infrastructure for ethics integration, infrastructure that might be well equipped to address broader ethical and social implications that I'm certain we'll consider in our later report. So the first report reflects our firm commitment to early integration through a timely dissemination of our own insights and conclusions. So let me just frame this briefly and then outline 3 potential recommendations and open it up for commission members to refine, reflect on what more or less, but probably more, because these will be broadly framed. But first, the context. The brain has long been an object of scientific inquiry. In its groundbreaking investigation of the brain and its relation to the mind, contemporary neuroscience both raises fundamental questions about what makes us human and also holds out hope for discovering improved interventions and perhaps even cures for brain-related diseases that afflict tens of millions of Americans and as many as 1 billion people worldwide. And some of the neurological illnesses that are for which there may be potential breakthroughs through neuroscience are dementia, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, bipolar disorder, traumatic brain injury, and that's just to name some of many. Many of the ethical issues raised in neuroscience research are not unique to this field. The ethics of data privacy, informed consent, minimization of risk, for example, are common to research in many scientific fields. Some issues, however, such as those regarding privacy of our thoughts, threats to our personal volition, or tinkering with our self-determination, or whether we are, over the lifetime, the same self or multiple selves, are expressed certainly in sharper relief in neuroscience. So let me just give one very brief, not thoroughly by any means played out example, which I think will play out more as an example in our report. Dementia. It raises a host of ethical and societal issues with which neuroscience and the Brain Initiative must inevitably engage. Prominent among these are questions about how dementia affects notions of the self, when informed consent is informed consent in the life of a patient who has progressive dementia. In the case of Alzheimer's, it is progressive over a large space of time, and that's researchers, healthcare providers, and loved ones face dilemmas when a person's previously healthy self expressed preferences that conflict with his or her current wishes and circumstances. For example, in her young adulthood, one patient strongly expressed she would never want to live in an assisted living facility, but her current self with dementia seems amenable to the idea. Healthcare professionals and loved ones must reconcile the ethical difficulties they encounter, such as when pre-dementia autonomy, post-dementia autonomy, decision-making capacity, and beneficence appear in conflict. That's a good example of where really careful research early on can make a difference in what scientists, clinicians understand and what ordinary citizens like all of ourselves who have to deal with this issue might do. An example we've been given: a man prior to having dementia expressed a strong and clear preference against invasive treatments if his cancer were to return. The cancer recurs many years later after he's progressed to the middle stages of Alzheimer's disease, at which time he insists on a major surgery that might extend his life but is unlikely to markedly improve its quality. The ethical question focuses on which version of his self should take priority and which decision best reflects his wishes. Neuroscience makes engagement with these issues inevitable. Its discoveries could also change how we view the self in those with dementia and in general. So neuroscience advances also can raise questions about justice and professional ethics, such as in the case of cognitive neuroenhancement, which we discussed yesterday. Humans have long had hopes and concerns about pharmacological and technological interventions to improve mental and physical capacities beyond normal functioning. The whole idea of normal functioning raises a host of issues. The terms cognitive enhancement and neuroenhancement cover a broad spectrum of methods, from nutrition to electromagnetic brain stimulation. These are methods that improve or are thought to improve some aspect of cognitive function. Effective and safe cognitive enhancers have the potential to offer significant individual and societal benefits, but they're full of risks also about the possibility of misuse. So that's just to put a context of why neuroscience raises in high relief some of the questions that ethics brings to science. So, although ethics is already integrated into science in various ways, as it is in many human activities, more explicit and systematic integration serves to bring implicit ethical judgments into sharper relief and allows their merits to be assessed more mindfully. So here are 3 potential recommendations for our consideration. Open it up for discussion after I review these 3. The first is a strong statement about ethics integration in neuroscience research, and that it should occur and should occur now with a rationale, a background rationale for that integration. We can't just say it and assume it. I think our earlier discussion, Nita, I thought, highlighted it, and I think we were all in heated agreement. We need the rationale for it, specifically the rationale for institutions and individuals engaged in neuroscience integrating ethics across the life of a research endeavor, wherever relevant, and taking immediate steps to make explicit a system for doing so. Not a single system across the tens of thousands of neuroscience researchers and hundreds, if not thousands, of institutions, but a system that works best on the ground. We must also recognize that successful integration cannot occur without resources, sufficient resources, including financial resources, human resources, and expertise must be dedicated to support ethics integration as well. So a recommendation along the lines that institutions and individuals engaged in neuroscience research should integrate ethics across the life of a research endeavor and take immediate steps to make explicit their means, systems for doing so. Sufficient resources must be dedicated to support such integration. So that's number 1. 2, it is critical that systems for integrating ethics in neuroscience research not operate in a vacuum. Once implemented, institutions and individuals engaged in neuroscience research should evaluate the effectiveness of their means and systems. Research funders should also support research that develops effective innovative approaches to integration and evaluates the most effective ones, existing and new approaches. So we learn from different approaches. The best available evidence of what works should inform ethics integration moving forward. So a draft recommendation would read something as follows. Upon implementing explicit systems for ethics integration, institutions and individuals engaged in neuroscience research should evaluate the effectiveness of their systems. Government agencies and other research funders should initiate and support research that, one, develops innovative approaches to ethics integration, and two, that evaluates existing and new approaches to ethics integration. Institutions and individuals engaged in neuroscience research should take into account the best available evidence for what works when implementing, modifying, or improving systems for ethics integration. So that's two. Finally, third, we've discussed this, and it's a premise of what we do, that the ethical challenges raised by neuroscience are not unique, and the ethics needed to ensure its progress overlaps with the ethics needed to ensure progress in most, if not all, science. We've heard repeatedly that it is essential to ensure that all scientists understand the role of ethics in good science, and I should say that all those involved in ethics understand the importance of understanding the empirical issues raised in science. Graduate school is the most specialized stage in the education of students. Bioethics education should continue through all stages of a scientist's education as ethical issues often become more complex, but graduate school is certainly not the best place to start ethics education. Foundations for ethical thinking must be laid earlier at all levels, and we should take this opportunity to recommend that research funders initiate and support research to develop and evaluate models for integrating ethics and science through education at all levels. This, in effect, is the companion to recognizing that we need science education early on in students' learning, and we need science and ethics education early on. Government agencies and other research funders should initiate and support research developing effective and innovative models and evaluating existing and new models for integrating ethics and science through education at all levels. And this is, in some sense, the backdrop recommendation for what I said earlier. I would like to co-author something on, ethics education in science or neuroscience. It's never too early or too late. And look at the different kinds of ethics education that exist out there and what's most promising and what kinds of research might be done to further that effective education. So those are the three potential recommendations. Question open to the commission. What do you think of any or each of these, and the approach that we're taking? And so I just open it up now. Christine.
So just based on our discussion this morning, I think that I suppose this is response to the first recommendation that you suggested, Amy. In addition to making a case and defending a good rationale for why ethics integration, I think we have to be very clear about what we mean it is, what ethics integration is, and maybe head on, I don't know, to address the issue of this is not risk mitigation and following rules, but is an inquiry into how to be socially responsible when you do your science, or some, I don't know how we're describe it, but we need to make a case. We need to be clear about what it is.
It's not primarily. It's not only or primarily that. I mean, there is.
No, there's some is.
Some.
Yeah, but we need to be really clear about what we mean by ethics integration, I guess is what I'm saying, and define it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and say what we mean. Dan.
sort of continue my theme of both and, I guess, for the last few days. And I think with respect to the to integration, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm 100% for it, but I think we should be careful not to craft it in such a way that we're putting all of our eggs into that basket, that we, I think, also would, both in terms of approach and in funding, want to see a place for sort of the kinds of centers that we heard about in the panel today, which would not be integrated, that we see the possibility of people being able to apply for funding for ethics regarding science in general, or the neurosciences in particular, that would not be part of something that was integrated, as well as promoting the new part, which would be integrated. And similarly to that, much of what we heard this morning is based on a sort of virtue-based approach to ethics education, which I think is extremely valuable. We also heard some people saying yesterday that, well, to reach the vast majority of scientists, you've got to have some clear rules and have the principles there. And so again, I want to say, both yes to both of those, and then to emphasize again from the discussion yesterday with Raju, that we want to have both local ethicists and funding for local ethicists to be able to teach formally in programs, particularly if they're integrated, but also to encourage better integration, to have the scientists themselves become sort of small group instructors and part of that enterprise. So there are three ways in which I'm very much in a both and mode over these 2 days.
And I think that lends itself to our developing a list of ways in which funders can move forward and support this. Yeah. Nelson.
So I like the obvious call for research being integrated with bioethics during the entire life cycle. I like the rationale, not only for institutions and PIs, but I assume we're also going to put a rationale in for the funders to be interested in doing this, for reasons I'll say in a second. Yeah. I think, like other reports, having a call for an evaluation, the impact of these recommendations is critical, because it provides I think the very vital durability of our interest in this. And lastly, and obviously it's very a very positive thing to emphasize that education during the entire life cycle of an investigator's career is really important, since it captures some of the issues in terms of the generational emphasis on ethics that is more recent than it is historical. Specifically, and I want to go back to the comments that we made at the very end of the session, I really think it's critical for us to emphasize that there is opportunity here. That we're not necessarily talking about risk mitigation, we're talking about opportunity. Opportunity for institutions, for PIs, for society as a whole, to see that an interdisciplinary approach, which is part of what comes from an ethical consultation, can open up new synergies. And that is something that is going to require that an investigator or institution think about second and third order effects of any science that we do. It's almost inconceivable to me that a principal investigator can believe that there can't possibly be second or third order effects, regardless of how fundamental that science is. And as a consequence of thinking those issues through, not only do you touch on what those second and third order effects might be in terms of risk mitigation, but you think about novel syntheses scientifically, open up new opportunities for PIs and institutions to go down research avenues that maybe have not been previously thought forward.
So let me underline Nelson's conclusion. I think it's really important in this report that we indicate how intellectually exciting and productive this pursuit is. That understanding more from a neuroscientific and ethical perspective of what's going on in the human brain is an enormously exciting intellectual
Yes.
venture. From both the ethics perspective and the neuroscience perspective, and it can only be done together because, for obvious reasons, but we'll give some examples of that. I have Steve and Jim, and the rest of my commission members, and I have you all down.
So I would also agree that this is a great beginning, and might want to just remind us of 2 points that we highlighted in our synthetic biology report that I think are very
Yes.
relevant here. And the first is that as we're speaking about education at all levels, we include public discourse and public education.
Excellent.
And also the possibility that we create some sort of fact check mechanism for
Yep.
new claims and ideas and accomplishments in neuroscience.
That's terrific. That is terrific. And I think that also underlines something that Nita said earlier about how there can be also resources to help scientists communicate publicly on this. So these are good because we need more, the more specific we can be in fleshing out not only the rationale, but the implications for these recommendations, the more useful it will be. Jim, you're next.
Just a couple of quick points. I hope that I was trying to be a PI. I was trying to sit here thinking about being a PI after all of these recommendations are implemented, and I'm hoping that as a PI.
I hope we get to that place.
Yeah, wouldn't that be
would
exciting?
wonderful.
Wouldn't that be exciting? But I hope we don't confuse the attachment of this very important dimension of neuroscience, the ethical dimension of neuroscience. I hope we don't confuse attachment and integration. Attachment meaning something that's hung onto this that I've got to pay attention to, even if I can find something exciting and inspiring about it. I fear that, I mean, you know the fears, I don't have to go there. But I do imagine, though, that there would be ways to challenge our PIs to imagine and even, maybe by specific questions, what it is that is expanded by, or what they anticipate the new ethical challenges to come from their research might be, so that there's a sense of ownership. I think until our PIs own some of this, I don't think we could claim that we've integrated it. We've just added it on, and we will end up. I'm sensitive to some of the language that we will that we may get back from our PIs if we don't. And a very brief comment apropos of making sure we don't offend PIs. I agree with you, Nelson. I cannot imagine in neuroscience any endeavor that doesn't have second and third order effects. And I think that's a fair statement. We can't imagine it. Having said that, I can imagine in other forms of science where, in fact, the science is pursued very simply for the joy of pursuing that science. Some of the biggest stuff we still fight about in physics, relativity and quantum theory, have their roots in simply the joy of understanding something. And people did not go down to second and third order effects of quantum theory to imagine nuclear power or nuclear disaster. So I would caution us against saying that there is never a scientific endeavor where a scientist, but what a scientist couldn't imagine second and third order effects. We can say we can't imagine it, and I really can't imagine it in neuroscience. But I want to caution us. Remember, we're talking about wanting to draw, in addition to the stick, Dan, we're talking about wanting to draw our PIs in this discipline into an understanding. We want to be careful not to offend.
Yeah. And we should remember that, and we saw it in the survey that Mildred had done, but you see it on the ground. We have about almost 200 neuroscientists, self-identified neuroscientists at Penn. And the vast majority of them, not all, but the vast majority of them are involved, care about the ethical issues of their research. This is a field, unlike some other fields, but like genomics, in which there is an intense interest in these issues. So this is not an overlay, this is a recognition and an endorsement of how we have.
Facilitation.
We
I
have
like
to,
that word.
we have to facilitate it and facilitate it more. And if there's no money behind it, it's the opposite of facilitation.
It's a requirement,
I have Nita,
a mandate.
Raju, and then Anita, and then Dan.
So I like very much the starting point that you've laid out and think that it captures well a lot of the sentiments that we've heard from different speakers as well as the conversations we've had. I just want to underscore a few things that we've said, but just to emphasize how important I think they are. The first is just much greater specificity. And by that I mean a couple of things. First, what do we mean by ethics integration? And we've talked about this, that we need to be very specific about models, but also what ethics integration. So not just models of how, but what it actually means. So what we're calling for people to do. So what kinds of questions they should be asking, what kinds of, far more than just ensuring the protection of the research subjects, being much more specific, because I think a lot of times when we're within a field, we can lose sight of the fact that in other areas, people don't even necessarily know what questions they should be asking or what it means, what ethics means, period. Which brings me to the second point.
So on the first, let me just, because I know you have the,
Yeah.
so because we're going to move ahead on this, the kinds of questions. We don't want to put, these are the
That's
only.
right.
But to give the sense of the kinds, so we give a sense of how broad the
Yes.
kinds of questions are.
And I don't just
That's all.
I don't just mean examples of questions. I mean, oftentimes you'll find people are really interested, they recognize the importance of responsible science, and they recognize that good science means responsible science, and they want to have an ethical inquiry, but they don't even know necessarily what that means. What does it mean to do an ethical inquiry? What does it mean to have ethics as part of the conversation? And so while that's self-evident and obvious to a group that's a bioethics commission, it isn't necessarily, and since this is meant to be instructive as well to the field, I mean models of and examples of questions and examples of how you might approach the kinds of issues that are at issue in these really diverse and interesting scientific inquiries. The second is highlighting science communication separately rather than just as part of the ethics integration. So we've mentioned it, we've had panels on it, but we have simply made it part of ethics integration. And I think recognizing it as both an ethical inquiry and an ethical responsibility of scientists, but being able to provide the separate justification, because we hear repeatedly and see examples of scientists saying things like, why would I want to talk to the public? And I don't mean just public and kind of lay audience science communication, but integration into congressional and legislative decision-making and legal decision-making, and the importance of neuroscientists and scientists being involved in those different areas and being willing to bring empirical evidence to bear on those types of questions. And I think providing the separate justification for why scientific communication is an essential part of ethical science, particularly in this context, which is so sensitive. And then last, I would just want us to highlight successful efforts already underway in the field. And just some examples of those. For example, the Society for Neuroscience already includes the David Kopf lecture every year, which is the neuroethics lecture at their annual convention. The International Neuroethics Society, which has ensured that its conference always occurs in tandem with the Society for Neuroscience, and they have significant public education and significant resources which are available to scientists. They've done some tremendous things, and I think showing that we're not just saying this is a field that's in its early days, but this is a field that already is taking ethics and integration of ethics quite seriously. Here's some examples of how it's happened successfully to show we recognize it and we celebrate it and want to use those as models to build and move ahead.
Good. Raju?
I just want to bring a little cautionary note about funding. President Obama in his State of the Union address sort of indicated, the need for more money for biomedical research. that doesn't necessarily mean that there would be more money for biomedical research. And I've read recently, an interview with Francis Collins, and Francis says that, I go to Congress many, many times, and I tell them about how exciting biomedical research is and why we need support. And the senators and representatives says, yes, everything you say is correct, but, we have a deficit, and that we may not be able to afford, more money for science. And even, in the case of the BRAIN initiative, the amount of money that President Obama announced is $100 million. I mean, it's a tiny amount of money. And so the cautionary note is that, if we were to make a recommendation, say that there should be significant amount of support for integration of ethics into science, and if there is no additional money that would be available to do that, then it either has to come out of what is currently spent for science, and so it is possible that if we make such a recommendation, it might fall on deaf ears. So we have to be cautious. And I think that the ideas that actually NIDA is suggesting, actually, they're exciting ideas, because those are ideas that don't require a significant amount of new spending, but within the framework of what we have, like the societies and so on and so forth, would be able to accomplish the goals of educating the scientists and researchers or clinicians about the importance of them and how they may be able to bring together.
Raj, or Amy, I guess I should ask you, do you imagine the charge from the president is such that we could at least talk about the monies that are the new monies that are being proposed?
Well, a number of people, Christine, for example, said earlier, if there aren't any resources, any put behind this, then it's not going to happen. And if we're serious about the integration of ethics and science, it is about the science, not about something that's separate. And it's not, the magnitude of resources is really small in comparison to what's needed to do lab science. So given that any scientific enterprise will be derailed if it isn't ethical in its nature, and given that good science means good ethics, there has to be some level, it's going to be a modest level, but it doesn't need to be more than a modest level of resource put in. Whether any level of resources incremental will come from the government is, as Raju said, an issue. But that hasn't prevented me and scientists, including Raju, for arguing for the need for devoting resources to this, because it is the economic engine of our society. It is also something that has been key to the goodness of our society. So I think it's not a reason not to make the case. It's, are we realistic about how much? Yeah, but if, you asked about the BRAIN initiative, if the BRAIN initiative doesn't put some amount of resources into the integration of ethics and neuroscience, then it's not serious about ethics. It's just as simple as that. You can't do it without any resources. You don't need huge resources to do it. So that's, and we're not going to lead with, we need more resources. What we're going to lead with are the things that really need, the substantive things that need to be done, and the resources adequate to doing them.
Can I just make a brief comment to it?
Sure.
So the point that you made is really excellent, because, because this President's request to the Commission came in the context of the BRAIN initiative. and that there are monies that are set aside for that, that would be a first place that the incorporation of this would take place. And as you know, all of us know, that there is a couple of different task forces that are currently thinking
Right.
about, and they're fighting in terms of what would constitute, the BRAIN initiative and where the efforts need to go. And I read, and I haven't participated in them, but I read the reviews of them. But the word ethics never
Yep.
came up in
Correct.
those reviews.
And there was not a single member of that advisory board that was self-identified or would be identified by the larger community as somebody who had expertise in ethics. So I think we should add in this preliminary report a recommendation that if, that should be,
Or we should maybe
Remedy.
bring the chair of that, of those task forces to come and talk about that, and that,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
we can mutually educate about this important issue.
right, right. And we have actually communicated, and those advisory groups are being reconstituted, so it's going to be really important. I think the sooner we can get this report out and that's some of the specifics that we need to put in the report. And it's important for public accountability. Just want to highlight well, let me let Anita and Dan go through, because we do have a hard stop at 12. So Anita, and then Dan.
I have just a very short suggestion, and I am so, Amy, I endorse all three of your suggested recommendations, and I love the conversation about how we can make them strong in terms of the report. But just one thing, we haven't talked much about how we educate divinity students and philosophy students to prepare them for their role as bioethicists. And if we don't include good science education into the
absolutely.
training of our future bioethicists, this
Sure.
ideal of integration is not going to work. You can't drop a naive humanist into the room of scientists and expect them to have any credibility. So I don't want to plug, Penn too much, but I do think that we have been at Penn trying to make sure that our bioethics fellows and master's students
Yeah.
and undergraduate students study science, learn rigorous methodologies, so that they can better perform as bioethics experts. So I just want to add that to the
It's a
the
two-way
conversation.
street.
It's a two-way street,
It's a
absolutely.
really important two-way street. Dan?
First, I'll just endorse that and say it's not just Penn that does this. Even at the University of Chicago Divinity School, for instance, we have seriously identified,
Dan.
to the extent that we are going to be applied at all, that it's ethics and the life sciences with broadly written, including environmental ethics, and we've got actually a search going on for an environmental ethicist, and we very much want to integrate science education for divinity students and people getting PhDs in religious ethics as well. So I think that's good. But to go back to the point I was going to make, I wanted to underscore Jim's point about the sort of sense in which I would like to see the report really hold up as an ideal. The dispassionate, disinterested desire to know, which is actually a quote from a Canadian philosopher. I don't know if our Canadians are here. This is Bernard Lonergan, as an ideal that is not simply to just get buy-in from the scientists, but something that we promote. One of our own principles is respect for academic freedom, and I think we ought to emphasize that in this report, and to recognize that maybe I read the quote that Mildred put up on the board differently than she did, and perhaps Peggy read it the way I did, that I don't think a scientist, there's a difference between a scientist saying that I am interested in understanding how this neuron works for the sake of understanding how this kind of neuron works, and saying that I'm constrained in being able to do that until I know that there is some sort of clinical application, which I think was the fear. And that sort of sense that we should promote academic freedom and this kind of dispassionate, disinterested desire to know is important and is different from that same scientist being disinterested in what happens to my science. And that's a critical distinction.
And important that scientists and the public understand that that's an ethical principle of the pursuit of science in an open democracy. So Nelson.
I was just going to comment for a second on, I think, Raju's important point that, we don't fall into this standard trap of not recognizing that there are research funding constraints and prioritization. But when I mentioned initially my first thoughts about the recommendations that you read, Amy, I specifically mentioned that a rationale for funders is really important. If we're working smarter, if we're avoiding having downstream investigations by groups like ORI, you're going to be inherently strengthening the research enterprise and inherently finding efficiencies in it. So it's probably going to be the case, and you mentioned also that we need to evaluate that system, so we'll actually have real data that could support this. This is probably going to allow the research enterprise to become more efficient, which means that and I know, again, it's a salve, but you can probably do more excuse me, with less money because you're not going to be having to spend dollars downstream with some of these unintended consequences. So, I don't think that's something we should push really hard, but I think inherent to understanding that we need to find a rationale for funders is capturing some of those comments that you made.